War never changes.
Train is a game you may never play. There's just one copy of it, and if you're lucky, it might tour through a museum in your city someday, but since most viewers here will probably never play it, I'm going to explain how it works. Players begin by smashing a complimentary window pane to kick off the competition. They roll die and play cards against one another to transport passengers, represented by these yellow tokens, to their destination before the other players do. After a few minutes, someone might finally reach their station, at which point they flip a terminus card to reveal where they ended up. And printed on the other side of those cards are names like Belzec and Auschwitz. As it turns out, players were shipping Holocaust victims to concentration camps the whole time, because those were the rules, and everyone was just following them without thinking about it. Once you're aware of the grand reveal, it's kinda hard to describe this thing as being fun. It's very, very tragic. But what makes it tragic? The words printed on the cards, or the rules of the game, or the relationship those two items share with one another?
War had never been so much fun. War had never been so much fun.
This War of Mine has the unusual distinction of being an anti-war game that might actually be fun to play. If the dreary artwork, the sappy music, and the sob story biographies don't tug your heartstrings, the desperate and challenging gameplay just might. And unlike Train, you might want to keep playing no matter how tragic it gets. It has fun gameplay, but considering how it was marketed, that raises an important question. Does that gameplay evoke the intended anti-war message? The answer to that question is probably going to depend on who's playing it. The activities and the actions that this War of Mine has the player doing are used to contextualize gameplay decisions that are going to sound vividly grim, but on the flip side, you can still approach those decisions cold and rational, and do the math behind them to weigh your investments and balance the risks and rewards of all your player inputs. For example, when supplies are running low and the only viable way to restock them is by venturing into an alley covered by snipers, do you send your sick, your wounded, or your elderly characters into danger? The variables you're playing with are themed after depressing war stories. You might decide to send Anton out to scavenge despite the snipers, because he doesn't have useful skills to contribute to the group. He is more disposable than the rest of them. You can rationalize sending him out to die, and that's very, very tragic. The development of this game was mainly inspired by accounts of the Bosnian War, particularly the 4-year-long siege of Sarajevo. This is where the team got ideas for a lot of the rules of the game's bartering economy. This is why you find yourself trading jewelry, coffee, and cigarettes for bullets and food, because that's what people did in the Bosnian War. That gives the gameplay mechanics a morbid context, which is important for games trying to evoke that anti-war sentiment. After all, Brenda Romero included her game Train in a series of games called The Mechanic is the Message. Papers, Please also used meaningful mechanics really well. The highly difficult rules, the convoluted limitations and balances, and the tragic stories that its mechanics tell can show us that war is complicated, that it can affect us in very subtle ways, that it is not easy to explain and never easy to deal with. On another level, experiencing these dismal mechanics can evoke the same kind of anxiety, frustration, and anger that often causes the revolts and the riots that lead to war. But experiencing that isn't exactly the SpongeBob definition of fun, but hundreds of thousands of players are buying these games up anyway. What they do that is so interesting is that they employ empathy. They're getting players to better understand the situations of other people by emulating those situations with gameplay. And if games want to preach empathetic against war, they're probably better off doing it through mechanics rather than narrative. That's why I don't think the supposedly anti-war message of Spec Ops really hit home. Or a lot of other conventional shooters that try to guilt-trip the player through completely uninteractive ways. Characters that are interactive game tokens and stories that are told by playing with those tokens aren't necessarily going to be Shakespeare, but they are going to be better suited to this medium. Spec Ops' story was a scathing critique of the way pop culture typically depicts war, but that story butts heads with gameplay mechanics that are a bog-standard demonstration of exactly what it's criticizing. And that may be the point. Your rewards for skillful play are cutscenes that are particularly grisly and brutal about the consequences of skillful play, but it didn't really hit me hard because I didn't feel responsible for those consequences. Between this War of Mine and Spec Ops, there are two big moments that fans like to claim are incredible emotional hooks. For Spec Ops, it's the white phosphorus scene. You have to bomb civilians with chemical weapons to progress the story. You don't have a choice in the matter. You can clearly see the huddled masses before hitting the trigger, and you can try to say no and try to avoid it any way you can, but you can't, because your main character is a homicidal maniac and there's nothing you can do to stop him, short of turning the game off. Maybe I'm a cold, emotionless bastard, but I did not feel an ounce of guilt about that. For this war of mine, the big scary moments that fans keep talking about is your experience inside the elderly couple's house. You can rob them blind right in front of their faces to restock your supplies if you have to, but you actually do have a choice about that. You have a lot of possibilities for avoiding it, in fact. It's totally possible to play through the game without killing or robbing anyone at all. The only reason why you would be robbing this poor old couple is if you failed at utilizing all the other alternatives the game gives you. And because of that, I felt like shit when I was swiping everything from their cabinets and watching them beg me to stop. On my first game, I had no clue what I was doing. Everyone was in dire straits, and I thought I hit the jackpot until their speech bubbles started popping up, and I realized what the game was trying to do. I had failed in a lot more ways than one by robbing that house. Although I was being rewarded by the raw materials I was stealing, the guilt and the shame took its toll on my characters, which gradually snowballed into worse situations, which made for some pretty harsh karma. The difference between Spec Ops and this war of mine is that in one game, being bad at it briefly gives you a second chance to do it right. But being bad at the other game creates exhaustive, long-lasting negative consequences that you have to keep playing with. It's the same deal with Papers, Please. It feels like the health and the happiness of your family at home is tied to your skill at the game, and slipping up makes the game even more demanding. There is a direct correlation between how bad you are at processing paperwork and how bad they are off as a family. The drama creates itself. It's predicted and prodded by the mechanics, but not explicitly written by the narrative. And in this war, and Papers, Please, the war itself is the antagonist. The fluctuating rules and the paranoia and the dangers of the world create shitty situations for you to deal with, rather than the actual walking, talking characters. The mechanic is the message. And big-budget AAA titles have actually not been avoiding that philosophy all this time. Metal Gear Solid 3 ends with a tear-jerking anti-war message about the lives of its characters being torn apart for meaningless political purposes. And that comes after 12 hours of explosive chase scenes and flashy gunplay. But when you're actually playing it, it's a stealth game. The challenge is all about killing as few people as possible. The game actively punishes you for racking up kills by making you wait through a long walk past the ghosts of your slain enemies later on. A lot of the thrill of high-level play comes from the surreal juxtaposition of blowing up the base, defeating the bad guy, and saving the world without taking a single soul in the process. It's a conventional, cinematic, action-packed game with play that subverts the conventional fetish for violence. It has anti-war sentiments in unexpected places, which is a trait it shares with the most seemingly pro-war games out there.
Gentlemen, we are going to war! Politicians will call it up.
I have not played any other game that makes war seem more unappealing than Arma 2. And this is a game that begins with American aircraft carriers blasting onto foreign soil while electric guitars blare about how badass all this is. The twist is that this is the consumer version of a military simulator actually used by militaries around the world. Which means you die in one shot, and you're probably not gonna know how or why, and you can't see shit, and your bullets never seem to hit where you're aiming. There's not much heroism involved in the combat in this game. There's nothing kinetically satisfying about it. It doesn't feel like there's a real connection between firing the bullet and getting the kill. Most of the time you're delivering suppressing fire into the tree line or the smoke or the village where enemies may be hiding, and someone's stray bullet or a shell from miles away is supposed to probably hit them, and that's actually how you're supposed to fight. It's dehumanized, long-distance, asymmetrical combat that you don't often see in games. Wargame Red Dragon takes a similar approach to depicting combat, and I was absolutely fascinated by it. In that game, using artillery shells to blow up buildings and napalm forests where enemies may or may not be hiding is the recommended strategy. And that's kind of terrifying. I played Arma 2 in a clan for a while. I really got into it a couple years ago, and I noticed that during those multiplayer clan sessions, I considered myself lucky to just spot an enemy foot soldier at all. If you're even luckier and get to shoot at them before they shoot you, the usual engagement distance is so far that they're dehumanized. They don't look like a person, they're just a fuzzy blur in the distance. There's no cover in the great outdoors, no abundance of chest-high walls or narrow choke points. The fuzzy blurs either suddenly make you dead or you suddenly make them dead, without either of you fairly exchanging blows in the process. And that's also kinda terrifying. In 2005, the US Department of Defense reported that American soldiers were using 250,000 bullets per insurgent killed in Afghanistan and Iraq. These games make news reports like that understandable. They make statistics about collateral damage make sense. Arma games reify the astronomical cost of war in a way that no other games really do. That's because it's based on a simulator. The implications of that make playing it compelling and also kind of uncomfortable at the same time. This may actually be what fighting looks like. It doesn't make for bloody and gruesome footage, but playing it actually feels terrifying. Its aesthetics and artwork look like borderline recruitment material, but its gameplay is deadly serious. And for me at least, that made it the most accidentally convincing anti-war war game I've ever played. I remember feeling a similar rude awakening after playing the first Rainbow Six for the first time. Rainbow Six's permadeaths and one-hit kills send a powerful message, and that message is that people are fragile. The thousands of bullets it takes to kill an enemy far away are just a prelude for the one bullet it takes up close. The deaths of your teammates in those games are always avoidable. There are no heroic sacrifices to be made, no inevitable tragedies. An entire lifetime can end in an instant, either by a stupid mistake or a failed strategy. And unlike Arma, restarting the mission after dying is not the default option. You might have to live with the consequences of your failures, and you will never be able to replace the people that die. It's pretty sobering, and it's delivered in a game that is otherwise about how awesome the guns and gadgets behind these operations are. And yet, right there, in the gut of its rules and mechanics, is an entirely different message about how easily breakable and irreplaceable people are. Imagine playing the story of Spec Ops inside of the game engine of an old-school Rainbow Six or Arma game. It would be nauseating. The complex controls, the slow movement, the blurry visuals, and the glitchy features of Arma would intensify the self-aware disgust of Spec Ops' plot. It might make for an experience far more hellish than what any market would be willing to stomach. Maybe most marketable game designs aren't suited to say war is hell, but rather war is too much trouble to deal with. Different audiences are going to interpret the same games differently, and while I found myself frightened by the overwhelming power displayed by the tactics in realistic war games, I found the aesthetics of this war of mine to be a bit melodramatic. At first glance, it looks more like a zombie game to me than a war game. I found myself identifying a lot more with the underpaid paper pushers in Papers, Please, but the protagonists of this war of mine, who are scavenging through rubble for food in a bombed-out city, are dealing with issues that, from the distance of my comfortable, safe life experiences, might as well be fantasy to me. But one commenter underneath the Rock Paper Shotgun review claimed to have lived through the siege of Sarajevo, and they said this game got a lot of things right, but one aspect they say it didn't get right is the mechanical reliance on scavenging and stealing. This commenter says that the people they knew in Sarajevo helped each other and shared their things with each other, and that holds up to other accounts of the siege too. People still had to live their lives during the war, after all. As the fighting increased and decreased, schools and hospitals would occasionally operate, and the streets were still policed. It wasn't totally as bleak and hopeless as what you see in this game heavily inspired by it. And in other games that heavily fetishize violence, you can also find mechanical messages condemning violence. Perhaps video games are more pessimistic about war than we usually assume.